All right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Arik Burakovsky. I serve as the Assistant Director of the Russia and Eurasia Program here at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. We're happy to have you join us for our online roundtable today titled Democracy in the Crosshairs, Unpacking Georgia's Foreign Influence Debate. Please note that the event is being recorded. Today, as we witness the passage of the foreign agents legislation in Georgia, growing protests in Tbilisi and across the country, and rising overt and tacit pressure on the Georgian government from the EU, the United States, and even Russia, we aim to have an informed, nuanced debate about the controversy surrounding the law. In this conversation, we will explore a number of topics, including the roots of the current crisis, the role of foreign influence in Georgian domestic politics, the implications of the bill for Georgian democracy, civil society, and media, how the law fits in the broader context of Georgia's foreign policy and its EU membership aspirations, how Georgian policymakers could address the concerns of domestic constituents and international partners about the law, something that it seems they are trying to do now, and future scenarios for Georgia's internal stability and international relations. We look forward to a lively exchange of ideas and thoughtful dialogue. We're pleased to be joined today by 6 esteemed experts from around the world and many other colleagues. I'm honored to moderate this conversation, and I will introduce each of them before they speak. We will give each participant no more than 7 minutes for opening remarks, and then I will invite them to give rebuttals to each other's arguments before welcoming questions from all of you. So our first speaker is Maya Otarashvili, who is the director of the Eurasia Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, FPRI. She is co-editor of FPRI's 2017 volume, Does Democracy Matter? The United States and Global Democracy Support. Her research interests include geopolitics and security of the Black Sea Caucasus region, Russian foreign policy, and the post-Soviet frozen conflicts of Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Transnistria. So Maya, the floor is yours.
Arik, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Fletcher School for inviting me. Thank you for organizing this discussion. I'm honored to be among this really great group of people here, and I look forward to the conversation. We could spend a lot of time looking at the nuances of various, NGO funding, transparency laws. We could spend a lot of time breaking down this foreign agents bill and its nature, but there's no point to any of that if we don't consider the context. And here, specifically in Georgia's case, today on May 17th of 2024, context matters. Make no mistake, this is an oligarchic regime. Bidzina Ivanishvili is a billionaire oligarch who has captured Georgia for 12 years now. So we have an oligarchic state capture, and this is a person who has a small group of sympathizers, his Georgian Dream Party, right? 84 parliamentarians who have voted for this bill. So that's a total of 85 people, essentially, versus hundreds of thousands of Georgians who have taken to the streets to show that they support Georgia's, yes, pro-Western, pro-European path, but more than anything, Georgia's freedom and their own freedoms. That's what this conversation is about. The thing is, there's really no point in discussing the bill itself unless we acknowledge the fact that Ivanishvili and his party have started to say the quiet part out loud. And what is that quiet part? So it was just a few days ago that the Georgian prime minister admitted that this has a lot to do with the fact that Ivanishvili has lost $2 billion to Credit Suisse. So initially, from the get-go, Georgia was supposed to be nothing but a piggy bank for Ivanishvili. Georgian people and the Georgian system were supposed to guarantee the safety of his money. That safety, that system has begun to break down. For a few years now, Ivanishvili has been fearing Western sanctions. He has been fearing that his money, his foreign assets are going to be frozen. Some of this has to do with the fact that he has brought Georgia much closer into Russia's orbit while actively cracking down on the civil society and democracy in Georgia. Some of that concern came from the time when his government arrested the former president, Saakashvili. So that concern has been there, and this oligarch feels less and less safe in Georgia and feels less and less safe about his money. There is no ideology here. This is all about Ivanishvili's billions and the safety of his money. There is an array of speeches, not just the speech that he made publicly a couple of weeks ago, but also the remarks that his team members are making almost every day, right? Again, speaking the quiet part out loud, the combination of the missing $2 billion. The latest was Prime Minister Gobakhidze saying, Ivanishvili put his $2 billion in the hands of the West, but the global war, it ended up in the hands of the global war party. This is the Prime Minister of Georgia saying this, right? So we have to also consider the context of the Foreign Agents Law in combination with the April 19th offshore law, so-called offshore law. So on April 19th, the Georgian parliament introduced a bill that is supposed to be about offshore assets. If someone moves their money into Georgia from offshore accounts, they can do so tax-free. And then that bill was vetoed by the president, but it's likely going to pass. You combine the offshore law with the foreign agents law, which again, the government has very clearly said the foreign agents law is all about reducing Western involvement in Georgia. What do you end up with? An oligarch that is, again, safe and comfortable inside Georgia and has his money safe and comfortable inside Georgia. So that context really matters. Let me add another piece of context that is extremely important. 85 people, so eventually plus the 84 people who voted for the foreign agents bill. 88% of Georgians support Georgia's EU membership. 75% of Georgians support Georgia's NATO membership. Also, hundreds of thousands of Georgians in the streets. I'm sure everyone has seen the amazing footage of the number of people, and predominantly young people, out in the streets protesting. This is not about my interpretation of the foreign agents bill or any other academic's interpretation. This is about the will of the Georgian people and the will of the young Georgian people. So as we discuss this, I just ask that we be respectful and not take away, right, not negate the agency of hundreds of thousands of Georgians who have taken to the streets for days on end now, many of whom have been arrested and beaten and continue to be arrested and beaten, but who have stuck together and stayed in the streets of Tbilisi and are not going anywhere. Now, just really quickly, one more minute, what's next? Most likely, the president of Georgia will veto the bill, but then the parliament will override the veto. So this is going to go on for a few more weeks, at least through June. And then in the fall, there's going to be a parliamentary election. Again, this is the next step in power consolidation for Ivanishvili, because after the election, one of the biggest pieces, obstacles for Georgian dream will go away, which is The president will be replaced by another president. Salome Zurabishvili has been really a chink in Ivanishvili's armor lately, especially since the war in Ukraine broke out, where she's been vetoing a lot of problematic legislation, but also has been pardoning a lot of political prisoners. So she will go away, and the parliament will be able to appoint future presidents, and obviously they will appoint a Georgian Dream sympathizer. So that will really open up the playing field for Ivanishvili. However, it's not guaranteed that he will win. And over the past few years, we've seen an extreme amount of voter intimidation and voter buying from the Georgian Dream Party down to the small villages and communities. We don't know that will work again, because you're looking at a massive number of young people who were not previously eligible to vote and are now going to be able to vote. One big problem that remains is sort of political distrust from all the protesters, from the young people especially. There's a lot of apathy and a lot of distrust towards politicians across the board. This is why we're not really seeing a lot of leadership in the protest movement. This is not about sort of appointing one strong man or one leader that's going to take over. So leadership is a problem, and I don't know how that will shape up. In the past, that has been one of the issues that has kept these kinds of protest movements from succeeding fully in bringing about actual political change. I have a lot more to say, but I'm going to pause here, be respectful of my colleagues here. So thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, Maya. Our next speaker is Almut Rochobansky, who has worked with civil society organizations and activists in many countries of the former Soviet Union, including Georgia, since the early 2000s, focusing on conflict and post-conflict regions, ethnic and religious minorities, women's rights, human rights, and peace building. A cross-cutting issue of her work has been funding for civil society, including resource mobilization from a wide range of international donors. Almut, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everybody, and good to be here with you. Thank you for the invitation. So I will take a somewhat different look at what precipitated this crisis. And I think it's important to understand just how extreme and exceptional a case Georgia is, not just compared to other post-Soviet countries, but basically few other countries around the world anywhere have ever opened themselves to foreign funding, to foreign-led social and political experiments, to foreign influence on its politics and policymaking like Georgia has. That started already in the 90s under Shevardnadze. It was then massively expanded by Saakashvili. And when Georgian Dream came into office 12 years ago, very important, they have stayed that course with great enthusiasm. So there have been exceptionally high levels of foreign aid, especially during the decade after the Rose Revolution, but then it plateaued at a really high level. And that has created a large and powerful NGO sector, which also serves as the main social lift into the upper or middle class. And simultaneously, in these conditions, there's been the most radical austerity and neoliberal policies. So what that means is that the state withdraws from service provision. The state also withdraws from policymaking, and foreign aid groups and NGOs step in, but they do it very sporadically, capriciously, and also, most importantly, without accountability to citizens. And when foreign aid donors and lenders and the NGOs, the contract in the ground, play such a dominating role, NGOs get a lot of power vis-a-vis other citizens without being accountable to them. And the EU association and candidacy process, which has been going on for just basically about the same amount of time that GD has been in power. What does that mean in practice? In practice, it means that every day, every year, large stacks of laws are dropped into Georgia's inbox, and they must then be transformed into Georgian legislation and, more importantly, implemented. And again, NGOs are contracted to do a lot of the technical drafting and monitoring work together with the government. Citizens, their needs, their concerns, they are excluded from this, love triangle, if you will. And all of this has eroded democracy and sovereignty. But this is not why Georgian Dream wants to pass this law. Not at all. Georgian Dream has been perfectly happy with this arrangement. They keep working with this NGO blob every day quite cordially. So why did they then pass this law? Because on top of this blob of all these many NGOs that do this day-to-day governance, policy making, law drafting, bit of service provision work, on top of this blob, there's a small cluster of NGOs. It's no more than 20 even now when some new ones have been added. They're mostly organizations in the area of knowledge production, like think tanks. They do training, they do strategic litigation, or just mobilizing the public. And among these NGOs are some of the most well-funded NGOs in all of Georgia. All of the funding comes from the West. Much of it comes from Western government donors, specifically. The loudest ones among them are led by members of the opposition, some of whom used to work in senior roles in the Saakashvili government. And they have been engaging in hyper-partisan politics for more than a decade, meaning they don't just side with the government in elections, which would already be bad enough if you're a nonprofit and if you have money from foreign governments, right? But they've been openly advocating for extra constitutional revolutionary change of power. They do this in the opposition media, on social media. They do this on stage at protests. They do not accept the government's legitimacy. For example, 2 years ago, they demanded that they should be appointed as a technocratic expert government to replace the current government. And the head of the most partisan NGO proposed herself as the new PM. And the question is, appointed by whom? Well, not by the public, who never voted for them, by the donors. So they've received money from Western taxpayer-funded grant makers, so from governments, embassies, other taxpayer funds, for street protests with partisan messages. And these street protests then are routinely also attempted to storm parliament. They also lobby quite openly. I mean, the letters are online, you can find them. They lobby foreign governments to enact punishment, such as sanctions on Georgian Dream, on Ivanishvili, but on others too. And at the same time, while they lobby these governments, they are being funded by these governments. And so they essentially are a proxy for the opposition. So what that means is that foreign donors fund de facto opposition parties, which they might otherwise be prohibited or unable to do under their own laws. So it's really no wonder that Georgian Dream has felt like they've been subjected to a slow motion regime change operation for much of their time in office. And if you talk to people who work like in European institutions, in the European Parliament, they confirmed that they saw this happening right in front of them. And we have to ask ourselves, here in the US, in Europe, anywhere, would we accept such a state of affairs in our own countries? And I would argue that we probably wouldn't, right? And so while there's a lot of things to say about the law itself, I would actually like to now go into what the EU's response to all of this has been. And I think it's very interesting here. This is a crisis that illustrates in a really sharp, clear way that an EU that wants to be a geopolitical actor will cease to be a normative actor. Article 54 of the Treaty on the Function of the EU says explicitly that the EU must not regulate NGOs. The European Court of Justice has confirmed that in previous cases. This also means that the EU cannot actually tell Georgia to regulate NGOs one way or another or not at all in the context of its candidacy agreement. That would be illegal for the EU to do. But if you listen to some of the language that's been coming out of Brussels and other capitals, first of all, it's never clear who actually speaks for the EU, and like any random NGO can make a grandiose statement, right? But if you read the statements of the actual EU representatives carefully, you can tell that they know that this is the case. They know that it is actually illegal for them to say that Georgia must not have such a law. So initially, some of them said that the law would go against the norms and values of the EU. And then they started changing the language. They started saying that it would go against our understanding, our expectations, which are very vague terms, but which are also terms not about norms, but about politics. And so no official who actually has the power to speak for the EU has said that this makes EU candidacy impossible. That has only been said by some MEPs or even just random politicians from EU member states who really have no say in this at all. So we've also seen, however, that the Commission has been more aggressive on this than the Council. But of course, the Commission is more dedicated to the geopolitical Europe agenda than the Council. In the end, however, it's the Council that decides on accession. And when European officials have made these threats about Georgia's European future, they have really been blackmailing Georgia. And this is extremely unseemly, I feel. I am an EU citizen, by the way. So basically, this has been a game of political chicken between the EU and Georgia. It's a game about like who will blink first. And so a few days ago, this law was now finally adopted. And all of a sudden, after the law was adopted, the European Council has completely changed their tune. So yesterday, Charles Michel, the president of the European Council, posted, and I'm going to quote, he posted that he spoke to the president and to PM Kobakidze, and he says, reiterated my full support in continuing to help Georgians to work towards a European future, including by helping to find the best way to address legitimate concerns of all sides. The Georgian government, by the way, has been sending similar signals for a few days too, kind of like, okay, let's just talk, right? We also do know, because it's been reported and confirmed by sources on both sides, that prior to this law was again brought up early this year, the second year in a row, and then accepted. Prior to that, the two sides, the EU, also the US, and the Georgian government negotiated for about a year. They negotiated about this problem that a very small group of hyper-partisan NGOs is being funded by Western government funders. And so the negotiations were about either you give us transparency, you make their funding transparent, or you stop funding them altogether, or maybe you like moderate their conduct so that they would behave more like NGOs behave in the West, you know, where they have very clear ethics and self-regulation rules about what they can and can't say and how they have to stay away from politics. So these negotiations failed, which is why the law was brought up the second time. And now we're back to negotiating. And ultimately, I think it's very important to understand this problem can only be resolved by a diplomatic agreement. A law, any law, the best law, a law that's somehow very democratic, a law that's somehow problematic, they cannot actually solve this problem. All right, and I will stop for here, and then later I'll be happy to answer questions about anything else. Thank you.
Thank you, Almut. Our next speaker is Maxim Krupski, who is a human rights defender, attorney at law, and PhD with more than 12 years of law practice in Russia, defending refugees, civil activists persecuted by the Russian authorities, and NGOs labeled as foreign agents. He is a former visiting scholar at Fletcher, a former non-resident fellow at George Washington University, and a research scholar at the Kennan Institute of the Woodrow Wilson International Center, focusing on foreign agents laws around the world. Maxim, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I think that, indeed, legislation to ensure transparency of foreign influence exists in dozens of countries around the world, and in particular, laws on foreign agents. However, I should say that the quality of these laws in terms of the rule of law differs significantly. And we should not forget that when we're talking about the foreign agents laws from Russia, from Georgia, the United States, or, for example, from Australia, we are talking about different laws of different content and quality, of different degrees of repressiveness. But yes, which in general terms address the idea of protecting sovereignty from foreign influence. For example, if we look at the Chinese law, so we can see that it requires NGOs to obtain government permission to conduct their activities and to register with the security authorities. In Uganda, NGOs cannot operate in any part of the country unless they receive also permission from the special body, the District NGO Monitoring Committee. In Kyrgyzstan, in April, there had been enacted a foreign agent law, which is literally a copy-paste legislation from the Russian law from 2012. So that is why I think the whataboutism about these laws is absolutely incorrect. and there is so much fog and incomprehensibility around these laws. I would say that no one denies that states should have the right to protect their sovereignty from undue illegal external influence and thus realize the principle of non-interference. That is non-negotiable, that's obvious. And officially, transparency legislation aims to do just that. However, I think that we all know that the transparency tools themselves should be as transparent and clear as possible. And if the law proposes to label someone as a foreign agent, the law should clearly spell out the criteria for agency activities or activities to represent the interests of a foreign power. The state must provide evidence of a link between the actor's activities and the interests of a foreign principal of or foreign power. Only then will the content of the law live up to its name, and then this procedure can be recognized as fair procedure. In the law, and if the law is written too broadly and gives incredible powers to the state to arbitrarily include the NGO, media outlet, or a person in a special list of so-called agents, then such a law is neither in line with its stated objectives nor with the rule of law. And if the law assumes that receiving foreign funding automatically means the fulfillment of someone else's foreign will, foreign interests, in the absence of any evidence, then such a law cannot be recognized as a fair law. And this is not my opinion, this is the position of independent expert bodies like, for example, the Venice Commission, and this position upheld by the judicial practice of the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights. The Georgian law provides that it is enough that NGO or media outlet receives more than 20% of its income in the form of money or other property from a foreign power during the year in order to be included in the register of so-called organizations carrying out of the interests of a foreign power. And I would like to say that this very construction is inherently unfair, as the only criterion for an organization to act in someone's interests is the receipt of foreign funding. It is as if it is stipulated by default. If you receive foreign money, then you're acting in foreign interests. The state thus, in fact, declares that receiving a grant from a foreign source deprives an organization of the opportunity to act in accordance with its own will, with its own goals, and in the interests of society and ordinary citizens. And this does not correspond to reality. I spent more than 10 years defending non-governmental organizations in Russia that received foreign funding. And I saw how these organizations, which defended the rights of prisoners and sought to prosecute, for example, sadistic police officers who engaged in torture, were considered foreign agents by the state. The same happened with organizations that defended the rights of women or children or HIV-positive people. And according to the state and in accordance with the law, they were all acting in the interests of so-called foreign power. And the state could never say in whose interest exactly. It's absurd when the state labels you an agent of nobody. And this is pure repressive legislation if we're talking about Russia, and this construction, the labeling of somebody as an agent of nobody without any evidence of this connection between activity and foreign interests. And this legislation is solely aimed at stigmatizing and discriminating against civil society. To some extent, in its spirit, the Georgian law, in my view, and especially the official rhetoric towards NGOs, resembles the Russian scenario, but I cannot agree at all that this Georgian draft law is Russian law, because the content of these two legal documents is very different. I would rather say that the Georgian law is similar in its content to the Hungarian Transparency Act from 2017. And the Hungarian law also provided that receiving a certain amount of money during a year automatically requires registration of an organization as a foreign agent, primarily NGOs. And it is important to emphasize also that in 2020, the European Court of Justice ruled that this law unjustifiably infringed on individuals' rights and freedom of assembly. In this thought, the Georgian law knowingly uses the concept and the construct of violating human rights. More importantly, this law does not even meet the stated goals of transparency of foreign influence, because let's assume that NGO or media organization receives funding from foundations in the United States, China, India, and donations from thousands of citizens from around the world. And at the same time, and in total, it is more than 20% of its annual income. And according to the Georgian law, this organization should be registered as foreign agents. And my question is, whose interests are represented in this case by such an organization, and whose influence is made more transparent? I cannot find any answers in this draft legislation. The situation with federal law, for example, and with the Australian law of foreign agents is quite different, because in these two acts, we can find the clear connection, clear legal connection between activities of NGO, for example, or other commercial or non-commercial organizations, and the interests of a foreign sources or a foreign principal. And moreover, these organizations should act on behalf or under control of the foreign principal. There is nothing in common with this construction in Georgian draft law. So it's in fact, it's unfair to compare these two legal acts. So finally, I can say that the Georgian law, in my view, discriminates against NGOs and media, because it does not apply to commercial organizations or political organizations, which have perhaps an even stronger impact on state sovereignty, and their activities should also be transparent. So it's, in fact, it's not only about transparency, it's about the somehow some acts, some activity of the state towards the NGOs and media, concrete. So I think that it's again, not only my opinion, but it's also judicial practice and the position of independent expert in legal field, that you cannot create a law that works only in this direction, only towards NGOs or media, if you're talking about transparency. So you must include in this legislation the whole bunch of actors. Well, I think that I stop here, and then I can answer the questions and participate in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxim. Our next speaker is Vyktor Kipiani, who is the chair of the Georgian think tank Geocase. His interests include international relations, security, governance, and global order implications for Georgia and its neighborhood, and macroeconomy. He is also a senior partner and a co-founder of MKD law firm based in Tbilisi. Vyktor, please.
Thank you, Alec. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for having this very timely discussions and conversation. I completely subscribe to what has been said before, that the central piece of discussions, it's not the law itself, but the context, and that's very important to remember. The context, it's about the rhetorics that surround the process itself. It's about the type of governance. It is also how the authorities address the protest in Tbilisi, and it's also about the expectation by Georgia by end of this year about opening the accession talks. So the whole context matters very much. If this specific draft of legislation was a central piece a year ago, it's sort of, discussion stepped beyond the framework of the law itself, and it became much more broad and much more encompassing. But even if we focus for a few minutes on the law itself, the simple connotation foreign influence, that's where the bone of contention lies. And it is indeed about very negative reminiscent of the past. When you speak about the foreign influence, and when you speak about the political legacy, or some type of cultural perceptions, if you wish, or for Georgians, for a Georgian mindset, speaking about foreign influence means as if you're supposed to run against national interests. And that is indeed, a very critical question, the foreign influence. Of course, the objective of pursuing legitimate transparency is very legitimate, very noble one. And we should also, I should also argue, probably I would be in a complete minority, that Georgian NGO is not sort of, untainted sector of activities, but still, that not something which should be confused when you give such a broader connotation in terms of pursuing foreign influence. And again, as it has been mentioned on a few occasions, about stigma. It's about labeling, not just recipients, but donors as well. And we should also bear in mind that, especially when you deal with such a sensitive piece of legislation, you have to have a viable institutions around judiciary, investigators, etc., to rein in any possible abuse of power by the authorities. So when the system is so much exposed to potential abuses, so in those conditions, in those circumstances, this piece of legislation becomes even more risky, even more dangerous. And I also agree with what Maxime has said. The only requirement of that threshold beyond the 20%, without setting forth any requirement to inquire what is the type of activities a certain NGO is pursuing, or a broadcaster, or private, or internet media. I think, this is very sort of, very, very dangerous and very, very risky and very abusive approach to the matter as well. Otherwise, the law itself provides, it's a very brief piece of legislation, but still with some pitfalls, potential pitfalls, or potential caveats. To mention just a few of them, that when the law speaks about about funding either NGO, Georgian broadcasters, printed or internet media, it could be even money given directly or an in-kind contribution. It is also interesting that even if a source could not be identified, still, those activities or that subject, that entity could fall under the application of the law on foreign influence transparency. Also, a few other things which have slipped just after the second reading. Georgian Dream has made repeated statements that the law would not apply to individuals. It still does not apply to individuals directly, but in the final version, we saw a very exceptional and very unexpected statement, which indirectly, but still relates to individuals. And it says that, especially in relation to the monitoring by the Ministry of Justice, which would have an access, and that's also important to bear in mind, to any type of information, including confidential information and including personal data as well. And any individual is expected to provide with any type of information, including personal data as well. If that is refused, if an individual fails to cooperate with the Ministry of Justice, then he would be fined. So this is very sort of, again, precarious and very slippery approach. Also, in terms of the monitoring, the law sets forth two grounds for the Ministry of Justice to start the monitoring. One is at the decision of the Ministry of Justice itself. However, the second ground, again, is very ambiguous, very vague and very broad. at the written request of any third party. That's also which clearly, again, I completely agree that this law is not so sort of, the mechanic copy paste of the Russian law, but still it provides for sort of, caveats of abusing the power by authorities in a wrong way. And the next thing probably which we have to mention when speaking about those pitfalls or those threats or hidden challenges that the Ministry of Justice is entitled to conduct that monitoring once within 6 months period every time. So I mean, this has also be a very short span of time. Otherwise, in terms of and also the definition of a foreign influence, also very broad and very encompassing. And also not to forget that the registry on those entities which would be in the service of foreign influence, that's also very challenging connotation, very challenging phrase, to be in the service of foreign influence when acting in Georgia. That register should be public. We already see and we already saw that even before this law has been promulgated, certain negative campaign has already started. That's what I again go to the point that it's not in as much about this piece of legislation, but about the context and about the environments. So therefore, it's not surprising that in expectation of the presidential veto, President Zurabishvili, she said very clearly that this law would be vetoed not just on a technical or legal grounds, but because of political considerations. And I fully agree with that approach and with that statement. So this is probably in a very nutshell, Eric. And again, if any specific questions, would be very open to addressing frank and candid manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. So our penultimate speaker, and I'm glad that she could join us ultimately, is Eto Buziashvili, who is a research associate for the Caucasus at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, DFR Lab. She researches influence operations and social media manipulation with a focus on Russia, Ukraine, Eastern Europe, and the South Caucasus. She previously advised the National Security Council of Georgia and worked as a senior analyst at the country's Ministry of Interior. Eto, please.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be joining you today. And I'm very sorry for being late. So we had a similar discussion at the Oxford University, which ended right now, and I jumped off that call. Repression through the legal means is a common practice among authoritarians, and the foreign agents law has become of such of the legislations. Georgia is not the only country where Russian modeled law was introduced, and I'm sure Maxim already addressed various instances of this law being passed in Kyrgyzstan, in Slovakia, and other countries. The main and crucial thing with this law is intent. And the intent of this law has been the same as in Russia and everywhere else where it was passed. It is to punish dissent and to punish any undesirable individual. Of course, to use the law for punishing, one needs the total control of institutions. And this is already the case. So for Georgia, various institutions over the past years have been captured by Ivanishvili and his party. They have appointed the loyalists on all the key positions, and the only remaining checks on the government currently is civil society and media, and the law intends to be a repressive mechanism against those remaining checks. There are two dimensions of current alarming developments in Georgia: the broader geopolitical context and the internal one. So the broader context is a global fight of freedom and democracy versus authoritarianism. And Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine, of course, falls into this as well because of the West's being very slow and indecisive in increasing its help to Ukraine, as well as to respond to authoritarian attempts to undermine democracies. Russia, as well as its allies, are emboldened to act more aggressively at home and abroad. And of course, Georgia is part of this global fight, and it's not only about Georgian people fighting its authoritarian government. In Georgia, Ivanishvili sees that the West sees the Western weakness in providing adequate responses to undermining democracy, and of course, acts accordingly. And then there is the internal dimension for autumn parliamentary elections, where there is an urgency of the regime's survival for Georgian dream. It does not need additional headache in forms of NGOs and media who will try their best to defend the elections and democracy in the country. To zoom in the internal dimension, this marks the first time in Georgia's history that the governing political party has declared a shift in the nation's Euro-Atlantic foreign policy alignment. This shift stands in stark contrast to the desires of more than 80% of Georgians who want to join European Union and more than 70% of Georgians who want to join NATO. Moreover, this shift breaches the Georgian constitution, particularly Article 78, which mandates the constitutional bodies to undertake all necessary measures to ensure Georgia's full integration into Euro-Atlantic institutions. It is important to highlight that ruling Georgian Dream Party presented itself as a pro-Western party at its beginning of its tenure in 2012. Yes, they did not continue a holistic, a hostile rhetoric of previous government towards Russia. However, they were constantly reaffirming Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations. But while their statements affirmed Georgia's commitment to Euro-Atlantic path and Western alliances, its policy actions did not align with these commitments. Even in the previous elections, GD was promising the continuation of Georgia's EU aspirations. Then, over past couple of years, many Georgians gradually realized that the country was distancing itself from the West and its values, as they were witnessing how judiciary was gradually captured, how there were many instances of human rights violations and crackdown on independent media. And with its with his April 29 speech, Ivanishvili basically confirmed what many observers have suspected about the party's intentions, beginning with its 2012 rise to power and increasing in recent years. It is pivoting Georgia's foreign policy, potentially leading to abandonment of the country's NATO and EU aspirations. And majority of the Georgians who are currently standing in the streets and protesting, they understand that at stake is their freedom and democracy. These protests are not about only Russian-style foreign agents law, because the law, it just encapsulates the broader ambitions of Georgian Dream Party to distance Georgia from Euro-Atlantic path and to cement country on Moscow's orbit. And basically this intention was perfectly and clearly articulated in Ivanishvili's April 29 speech, when he basically openly designated the West as an external adversary and described Georgia's civil society as internal one. He declared everybody as a member of Western spy ring and promised some Soviet-style repressions. This morning, I was listening to Hans Gutbord. He is a professor of public policy in Ilya University in Georgia. He was basically elaborating on why this law is aimed at shutting down NGOs and its broader risk of devastating of anything that is not state control. He mentioned a good example, a report produced by Transparency International Georgia. It's a really nice example here. So this report documents 150 cases of allegations of high-level corruption in Georgia that are not investigated. And 30 out of 150 concern Georgian Dreams MPs that are voting for the law. And other cases concern highest level officials, including the prime minister, etc. So, of course, they do not need NGOs like Transparency International operating in Georgia and documenting the corruption or human rights violations. And I won't even go into details of the transparency because one just needs to go to their websites to see the detailed breakdown on their spending and the donor funding, as well as not to even mention the fact that everybody's paying taxes, and it's been the case since forever here. And just last but not least, I really want to quickly elaborate on brutal crackdowns that are already happening in Georgia, even though the law is not operational yet. So things have been developing quickly over the past 3 weeks, but it's been like past couple of days that they progressed at unimaginable speed. So, for example, the massive campaign of intimidation, when thousands of people, like activists, NGO representatives, media, and their families, including underaged, are receiving calls from foreign cell numbers with insults and threats in what seems a coordinated and centralized effort to sow fear and intimidate civil society. But then we're seeing the increasing and alarming number of physical attacks on those people in the streets and in front of their houses. They are being beaten by so-called titushki, the term which was coined back in 2014 in Ukraine, where illegal formation of men dressed in black without any identification marks were beating protesters and provoking some arrests. There were some reports by media who investigated some of titushki, which basically found that they are the employees of security firms with connections to State Security Service of Georgia. But then, not even waiting for the passing law, the chair of the parliament announced a couple of days ago that they will be creating kind of a database, kind of an enemy list or the blacklist or name it whatever you want, where they will be putting individuals undesirable to them. And last but not least, soon after this statement, there were created a couple of channels on Telegram, the messaging app, which is also popular in Georgia in addition to Facebook, which started to leak personal information of people, the activists, including home addresses and phone numbers, and basically calling people to attack them. And one of these channels belongs to government-affiliated media Post TV. And the last but not least, the Ministry of Interior a couple of days ago announced the violent crackdowns will be increasing in number and in brutality. So this is a current situation here, even without passing the law.
Thank you, Eto. And last but not least, we have Anatol Levin, who is the director of the Eurasia Program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington, D.C. He was previously a professor at Georgetown University in Qatar and worked as a British journalist in South Asia, Afghanistan, the former Soviet Union, and Eastern Europe. Anatol, please.
Thank you. I do have to say that I think, given the nature of this discussion, it might have been a good idea to have somebody from the government side as well to set out their case, but, you know, for the sake of you know, balance and listening to a Georgian debate, because there clearly is a Georgian debate. I'd like to thank Maxim very much for his extremely, you know, detailed and interesting and balanced approach to this question. I too have considerable doubts about this law, I should say, although he is far more of an expert than I am. I'm in a slightly complicated position when it comes to transparency about funding, because my institute, the Quincy, has been advocating very strongly for much tougher rules about transparency of funding as regards American think tanks and individuals in think tanks, not NGOs in general, but there is a really big problem about foreign money now, in Washington, basically buying opinion, buying pens for hire, and of course buying congressmen and senators. It does make it a little bit difficult for me to argue against laws requiring greater transparency. But as I say, there are obviously highly questionable aspects of this law. And as far as I can see, I would agree with Maxime that, however, that it doesn't, this law at least, whatever might happen in future, does not approach the level of either breadth or repression of the Russian law. But I think as far as the European Union is concerned, the question of the legitimacy of this law should be a question for the European Court of Justice. And the European Court of Justice should also rule on whether this law is compatible with the conditions of the acquis communautaire. If they rule that it isn't, then of course this is a clear barrier to Georgians' path towards the European Union, though it could be that by the time the court has ruled on this, you will find some Western European governments adopting similar laws. Some of them appear to be heading in that direction. But I do not think that it is for the European Commission or the Council to preempt the ECJ on this. There are European mechanisms for judging other people's, the laws of other countries and EU applicants. As far as the Georgian people are concerned, this is a matter for the elected parliament. And if the people, a majority of the people disagree profoundly with what the elected parliament has been doing, then of course they should have the right to vote that parliament out or vote MPs out at the next elections and replace them. And there are of course new parliamentary elections due in Georgia in October. And I certainly think that the European Union should insist strongly on the strongest possible international monitoring of these elections. And if the EU and other international monitors conclude that the elections were in fact rigged, that they were not sufficiently free and fair, then that would be an overwhelming obstacle and should be to Georgia's path towards the European Union, and indeed that should be made clear to the Georgian people. However, it does seem to me, both from my own visit to Georgia last year and from Dr. Otarishvili's remarks, that I cannot say, of course, what a majority of the demonstrators at present in Tbilisi want, but the opposition, much of it, is aiming at using these demonstrations to bring about regime change through street power. And the overthrow of what is, after all, an elected government, however much one might dislike it. And the last elections in Georgia produced a convincing majority for Georgian Dream and were certified as not perfect. I certainly wouldn't regard either British or American elections as perfect in many regards, but generally free and fair by international observers. And I'm afraid I cannot support the overthrow of an elected government by street power, in part because I was a British journalist in Georgia in the early and mid-1990s, in which there were, of course, repeated regime changes through either street power or military power. And that was, and by the way, I mean, all the forces involved claimed to be acting in the name of democracy and the Georgian people. of course, all politicians claim to be acting in the name of the people, but one shouldn't allow anyone to get away with that without challenge. As I say, I mean, the only legitimate way of assessing what a majority of the people want is elections. And I think that, speaking as somebody who strongly supports Georgia's membership of the European Union myself, I do think that we should be concerned about what a return of deep political instability and the re-establishment of street power as the way to remove governments would itself do to Georgia's path towards the European Union, which is critically dependent on democratic stability and democratic continuity. Now, I have no idea, honestly, what a majority of Georgians think about this law, or indeed the Georgian Dream government. But once again, this should be a matter for the next elections in October. And I mean, I have to say that I think it should be entirely obvious that the portrayal of the Georgian Dream government and Georgian Dream, simply as the rule of an oligarchy of 85 MPs is not accurate. Once again, I don't know whether it is a majority, but undoubtedly Georgian Dream does have a great deal of popular support in Georgia from a variety of sources. And here I think we should also worry about the overthrow of an elected government by the streets, chiefly of Tbilisi, because it does appear that Georgian politics are to some extent fragmented along both class and regional lines. And if this government were to be overthrown by the streets of Tbilisi, especially if explicitly backed by the European Union and Western powers, this could establish the profound fractures in Georgian society, or along new lines perhaps, that we have seen previously and were so damaging to Georgia for so many years. The other thing I think point to be made is that the European Union itself should be careful about this business of helping to get rid of governments it doesn't like, and also interfering too closely in the domestic affairs of other countries, because this has contributed to a number of populist backlashes, which on the whole I should say I greatly dislike, but in a large number of European countries. It also, of course, violates the European Union's own principle of subsidiarity. So I would say, these questions are a matter for elections and the courts, and this is what we should support in Georgia.
Thank you, Anatol. Now, I have plenty of questions of my own, but given that we have very limited time, we'll go straight to the Q&A session with the audience. But Maya, since Anatol mentioned you, I'd like to give you a chance to respond.
Yeah, just a quick clarification. There is no real conversation about a government overthrow. There is no real conversation about street power as the way to remove a government. These protesters are very much out in the streets protesting against this power consolidation, against the law itself. So this is definitely no Georgia of 2003, right? This is one thing that's really remarkable about this protest movement is how it is not so political, that it's not led by a political leader, right? So I think that's really important. And sir, you mentioned that you have no idea what the Georgian people think of this law. You know, hundreds of thousands of them are in the street.
I have no idea what a majority of Georgian people think of this.
So I think
this is a question for elections, not for street demonstrations.
Right. So I think that at this point it's just kind of subject to interpretation. I guess you can kind of look at the facts in front of us. So I'll stop here. I just want to clarify, this is not, we are so far from that kind of a conversation about a government overthrow through street protests. This is a much more nuanced and evolved protest than that.
Well, I guess the question is, what is the long-term scenario here? What are the next steps for both the government and for the protest movement? Eto, it looked like you wanted to respond.
No, I just wanted to briefly add on what Maya already mentioned. If somebody doesn't know what majority of Georgians think, you could maybe check out the 2023 polls by CRRC, which is an unbiased organization. And back then, a year before, the majority of Georgians, I think it was 50-something, 54 or 55, they were against this law. And in addition, these protests this year are larger, and they are continuing, and they are longer, I mean, in lengths. So I think that it's another response on top of the last year's pollings there on what Georgians think.
Excellent. So now we're ready to take questions from the audience. Please raise your Zoom hand or write a question in the chat, and I will call on you, and we'll try to take as many questions as we can in the short time that we have. Looks like there's a question from Nate.
Thanks.
One in the chat.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to add on this as well that like the vast majority of rhetoric that I've seen here in Tbilisi about the government overthrow is coming from the government. I don't see, I mean, for example, when the government arrested 2 Americans earlier this week, the first accusation was that they were here to instigate a revolution. And I mean, I know them personally. It's absolutely ridiculous. But as an aside, I wanted to ask, what's the let's say the law is enacted as it is now. How does this impact Georgia's relations with the U.S. and what can we expect from the U.S. government in terms of sanctions, consequences, etc.?
Excellent. So we've already talked about possible responses from the EU. What might be the response from the United States? Who would like to take that?
I mean, the response from the US is likely to be very hostile. I mean, how far they will go in sanctions, I don't know. But I would not myself support sanctions. I would support sanctions if it is established that the next elections are seriously unfair and rigged.
I'd like to elaborate on what Nate just mentioned and what already was mentioned many times, the words government overthrow. Given that I'm researching information operations and influence operations for long, I really wanted to address that part. So before introducing this law, there was a whole stage-setting information operation conducted throughout at least 2 years, starting from Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine. So back then, right after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, there emerged a war-dragging narrative in Georgian information space that the West is trying to drag Georgia into war, and then the West is also trying to organize a revolution. So these narratives date back many years in Georgia. Back then, before 2022, this narrative was pushed by openly pro-Russian political parties and groups, as well as the Kremlin officials and actors. The major shift that happened in the information space is that after 2022, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, ruling Georgian Dream Party became the main actor, together with the Kremlin officials who were actively pushing for the narrative that the West is trying to drag Georgia into war, as well as West is trying to organize a violent overthrow of the government. And then this narrative escalated. The second part of the narrative escalated with blames of the U.S. of organizing, funding organizations that are organizing the overthrow. And then one of the far-right groups also announced that they are creating an anti-Maidan movement, which sounds like an illegal paramilitary formation, because they announced that they will be targeting all the protesters. So basically, with all these narratives spread for already at least 2 years, we're seeing how the government, as well as their allies, are trying to delegitimize any kind of protest which will take place in Georgia. So they're kind of saying in advance that if you protest against us, this will be illegitimate because you are not an ordinary Georgian citizen, but you are the part of West inspiring that is trying to organize the violent overthrow of the government. So again, and this narrative is very dangerous. And if you just look to the streets or listen to Georgians, nobody plans to overthrow the government.
Well, when we speak of narratives, one of the narratives that I've seen come up in Georgia in recent years is that even though most of Georgian society supports EU integration, they seem to support peace much more. And so if EU integration comes at the cost of internal instability or conflict with Russia, that they would choose to stay peaceful. But I think that may be a false dichotomy.
Exactly, that's a false dilemma that we have seen introduced in the government-run, government-affiliated media outlets, which are basically introducing that very question. If EU asks you to join the war, would you prefer to be a member of EU or have peace? This is a completely, I don't even know how to, it's a false dilemma set to Georgians to deceive them and to basically, to make them remember that Trump was of 2008 war.
So I see several hands up. Anatol?
Yeah, well, perhaps I could just repeat something I heard from the head of a Georgian pro-European NGO last year when I was in Tbilisi, and he gave me 45 minutes, I think, about of pure opposition propaganda against the government. And then I said, but hang on, you're supported by the EU, not as a political force, right? You're supposed to be apolitical. And he replied, we are apolitical. I said, well, but you've just been entirely supporting opposition positions. No, I haven't been supporting opposition positions. I've just been giving you facts. So you see, it is rather common for either side in a political debate, and let me stress, there is a political debate in Georgia, in Georgian society, for each side to say, oh, the other side is engaging in information operations and propaganda and so on, but we are just giving the facts. Clearly, both sides in Georgia have engaged in attempts to manipulate the public. If you were cynical, you could say that is what political parties are there for. And the other thing I would just like to say is that I think that government propaganda about the threat of war is undoubtedly exaggerated, but it is not unreasonable for Georgians to worry, and so many I talked to did worry about, about conflict with Russia, given Georgia's disastrous experience in the past. That is a legitimate concern. Trade with Russia is a legitimate concern for so many ordinary Georgians. And it is also a legitimate concern how far the West will in the end help Georgia. That Georgia could find itself wrecking its relations with Russia, and yet, because of internal developments in the West, not in fact being accepted into the West, the future is open, one should remember. The membership of NATO and the European Union is regarded, by many in Georgia as as the end of history. But of course it isn't. In America, we are thinking about the consequences if Donald Trump, for NATO and for transatlantic relations, if Donald Trump is elected in November. In Europe, we are thinking about the consequences if Le Pen's party is elected in France, or the consequences for the European Union. It is a mistake, I think, or rather, I don't know whether it is a mistake, but there is a perfectly legitimate discussion to be had about whether it is wise for Georgia to put all its eggs in the European basket.
Thank you, Anatol. Maya?
I think Mr. Levin is absolutely correct. I think that's a really accurate observation, that it is not unreasonable to worry about the Russian threat. That's essentially what has brought out all these people out into the streets. And that is kind of a situation under which Georgians have lived for a couple hundred years now. So I think that is a very accurate observation. It is very reasonable to worry about the Russian threat. It is something that everyday Georgians are kind of born into at this point. So I agree completely. And again, one way that the Georgian people are trying to deal with that is to fight for their freedoms, for their rights, and fight for a way out of this Russian orbit. There is some, earlier it was mentioned how this is not necessarily identical to the Russian law. The idea that this is being called the Russian law is, I think, can also be seen as a warning. Look at how this law was used as a basis to isolate Russia from the outside world and from the West. As of May 6th, now anyone registered as a foreign agent can no longer participate in elections in Russia. So this is a cautionary tale and a warning, something that the Georgians don't want. Really quickly about the potential US responses. I anticipate no US response, and at best it will be lukewarm. If you know anything about US-Georgia policy over the last, decade or so, you will know that the United States has been pretty much going along with all the abuse, certainly the verbal abuse that has come out of the Georgian government officials' mouths towards Western leaders, Western politicians, and certainly American diplomats and politicians. So far, the U.S. has kind of rolled with the punches. Georgia is not a priority for America, and the Georgian people are essentially on their own as far as I'm concerned. So if there is a positive change, if the people prevail here and the positive change, it will not be because the United States was involved or aggressive in any way. And if anybody disagrees with that, just look at the US policies towards the region, right? Whether that's Nagorno-Karabakh or overall the Black Sea, even Ukraine, right? Georgia's democracy is Georgia in itself is not really at the top of the list of priorities in Washington, which is obviously disheartening. But this goes back to the idea of this is about the will of the Georgian people. This is about what they want, and they're making their voices heard very loudly. And the least we can do is just respect that, and again, not take away their agency in this situation, and be informed. about what they're saying and what they're preferring, what they prefer, because again, they have not been quiet.
Thank you, Maya.
May I just say something?
Okay,
On
very
behalf
quick.
of the Quincy Institute, the Quincy Institute does not claim to speak for the Georgian people. Might I suggest that the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia also not do so?
Opinions here are my own and my own
Then
only.
you do not speak for the
FRI
Georgian people.
is nonpartisan and certainly does not speak for the Georgian people. I'm not sure. All right, I'll stop here.
Well, I'll just say that opinions are of the individual participants, not of the institutions they represent. Almut, go ahead.
So, Arik, I actually wanted to talk about your question of if push comes to shove, Georgians would have to decide between the EU and peace, they would be forced to choose peace. I think it is really unfair and cruel towards Georgians that their so-called Western partners constantly present them with these stark choices. And I think they really do. Like, there's a lot of blackmail going on. There's a lot of, I mean, we see, for example, now that this current acute crisis has shown that for 6 weeks, the Georgian government and the EU were doubling down on the threats to each other and sort of like playing high stakes poker and causing enormous stress and trauma and disruption and fear to ordinary Georgians. And then the laws passed and both sides go like, okay, we can just talk now, and like this was completely I don't see why it has to be like that. And I actually see a lot of responsibility with the EU not to do that. Yes, the EU has never actually, as the EU, right, told Georgia, you must, go to war with Russia. However, when Georgia did not fully join the European Union sanctions against Russia, the relations getting colder and a lot of pressure around that was very pronounced. And there was no concern whatsoever that for Georgia to be doing that would be a vastly more dangerous and existentially threatening move than, say, for Luxembourg or Denmark to do that, right? Who are not just, they're protected by NATO and they're like on the other side of the continent. And I also have to say it is very important that a number of people who pretend to speak on behalf of the EU, mostly MEPs, or just individual European politicians, in their domestic politics, they say these things and nobody like whistles them back, right? Like the council, the commission, they don't tell them, actually, this is not correct. And on the ground in Georgia, I've seen again and again how statements by people who claim to speak on behalf of the EU, and sometimes these are just people who are like work for an EU-funded think tank, right? The European, like a German think tank, how they're not corrected, right? And I think this is causing a lot of trauma and fear and worry and stress to Georgians. And Georgians are already a very traumatized and stressed population. Like they are undergoing, like we are not even talking about this here, but let's talk about the fact that in 30 years of independence, Georgia has lost 1/3 of its population, mostly to labor migration. Let's talk about the fact that in the years 2021, 22, and 23, labor migration, mostly into illegal shadow labor markets in Europe, exploded. And what this does to families and how, how much depends on them. So when the EU now, one of the threats that was sort of, again, not coming from the council or the commission, but from some random MEPs, oh, you will just take away your visa-free travel. This isn't about depriving Georgians from a weekend vacation in Paris. None of them can afford that anyway, very few. This is because hundreds of thousands of Georgians have used this visa-free to go into this visa-free arrangement to go into those European countries that then offer them a so legal, exploitative, not very good pathway into a semi-legal status where they can then, like in Italy, they can sit at home and watch an elderly person for 800 euros a month, right? So when someone in Brussels, or not even in Brussels, in Poland or in Latvia says, ooh, you won't have visa-free anymore, families are put into existential stress and fear. I think this needs to stop. This is what I feel as an EU citizen. I'm not speaking for any Jordans. I'm not speaking for all of the EU, but I personally feel that way. Thank you.
Thank you, Almut. And just to add, I think in Georgia, being concerned about the threat from Russia is not mutually exclusive from supporting trade with Russia. And I think often politicians who support economic ties with Russia are labeled as pro-Russian, whereas in fact the reality is much more complicated. But we have a hand raised by Lasha. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Eric. I think as organizers, we have to sacrifice our opinions here. So, it's great that you've given me this chance just for real quickly make some comments. Thank you all for coming out and expressing your respective views. Thank you, Anatol, for your sobering assessment on all things Georgia, and that, in my opinion, leads more towards the assessment of geopolitical risks that Georgia faces, and unfortunately, to its own detriment, it has been ignored. And thank you, Almut. Couldn't agree with you more. And Maxim Krovsky. I agree and disagree with the rest of the speakers to a certain extent, to a large extent, but it doesn't matter right now. Just from my own perspective, I'm not a legal expert, so I'm just going to make quick comments on legality of this thing. In terms of proving intent, what this law intends, I think even you don't have to be a legal expert to understand that this is an extremely difficult area in the jurisprudence to prove. On criminal cases and national cases, doesn't matter. Proving intent and then blaming somebody what he or she intends is a different. It's a very difficult space to dab into and analyze and prove. So yes, I agree with the idea of polishing up this law. I agree with the idea that there is a problem in a country like Georgia. There could be a problem with the lack of checks and balances, and given Georgia's past 30 years of history, or especially between 2003 and 2012, the government abuse is just par for the course, and it is unfortunate. But there is no doubt that if anybody's looking at this seriously, that under the current government, and I'm not defending anyone here, please, before you call me pro-Russian or anything, the current government, you could make a strong case that is much less autocratic than the previous government. Second point I want to make is this: how can we not talk about geopolitics here? I'm going to mention a couple of forbidden words in Georgian society: national security interest, geopolitics, regional geopolitics, and John Mearsheimer. These are forbidden words. You cannot talk about these words in Georgia. And every concept that flows out of these words that talks about realpolitik and the necessity and existential threat that Georgia faces, and the only way you can basically address this is through realism and realist foreign policy, is marginalized in Georgia. You cannot basically talk about this without being accused of, pro-Russian, being pro-Russian, and it's unfortunate. And I want to finish this by saying, what if this current, and just bear with me here, this is a hypothetical question. What if the current pragmatic politics in Georgia, in Tbilisi, create a real space with Moscow to start to negotiate restoration of Georgia's sovereignty? Down the road, this is a big if. We all recognize how hard and difficult that prospect is, but it's a plausible. Probability is very low, but it is possibility. What will be the role of Washington in the region if that happens? And if pragmatic, emotionless, devoid of ideological tendencies, pragmatic foreign policy succeeds and Georgia's sovereignty is restored, what do we do then? Where is going to be the United States and Washington's role in the region? And that leads me to ask, why are we not supposing that, given the global shifts and unipolarity, multipolarity, all this, are we not supposing that perhaps maybe that Washington's power politics, Washington's involvement in Georgia and its wherewithal is declining? Are we not, in relative terms, of course, the United States still remains to be the most powerful richest country on the planet, but in relative terms, where are we seeing Washington today? This is not the Washington of Freedom Agenda and the Bush and George W. Bush. So how do you assess that? How do you put that all together? And does Georgia's restoration of full sovereignty matter at all at this point? Thank you.
Lasha, we are out of time, but I would like to give the participants a chance to quickly respond and perhaps make concluding remarks. We received a message from Victor that he experienced a power outage, unfortunately, which is why he had to leave. He didn't have internet access. But let's go around any responses to the prior question about the geopolitical situation and the role that the United States can play, and any concluding remarks. Maya, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting now is to see what happens next, right? The election in the fall, and how this moment in the civil society is going to impact what happens in the fall in Georgia. Like I said, I very much believe that whatever happens is going to be a result of internal, what's happening internally. What's very interesting to me is how the young voters are going to impact the election in the fall. Again, like I said, the last time, a lot of the people who are in the street right now were not even eligible to vote last time. So I'm very interested to see how that shapes up. But I want to just go back one more time and reiterate, unless we see this from the prism of an oligarchic regime that is trying to further consolidate its power and influence, we're not seeing a clear picture. And isolating single pieces of legislation and discussing them in, as a hypothetical, that's a wonderful thought exercise, but it is not helpful or productive in this situation. It's very important to understand the context on the ground. This is an oligarchy that's trying to consolidate its power.
Definitely. I definitely agree with everything that Maya just said. And today we discussed the facts of capture of institutions, the crackdown on media, capture of judiciary, etc. So definitely it's an attempt to consolidate power, and it remains to be seen what happens on the election and how people vote, especially so-called Gen Z.
Thank you, Eto. Almut?
Yeah, I actually want to get back to something that Maxime said, and I promise it is actually about geopolitics too. So I think Maxime and I have worked with the same Russian human rights organizations you mentioned, and I am such a great fan of them. But what I do want to say, so this notion that the Russian law and the Georgian law, that there's somehow something missing, and that is the definition of showing that there's actually an interest of the foreign instruction. There's no instruction from the foreign actor. I think that is one of the issues when I like to talk about, we have to be honest with ourselves. Are we then to assume that foreign governments or large Western foundations put money into countries like Georgia out of pure altruism, that they have no interest at all? That would be ridiculous, right? And yet we are told, we're sort of gaslit into always acting like that was the case. We're just there because we want to support a vibrant civil society. We're just there because, we just support that country. They are partners. No, this is very clear. And how does this play out in reality? It is absolutely true that when a foreign donor makes a grant to an organization like the one that Maxime defended and that I have worked with, they don't tell them you must do X, Y, and Z. They don't. But what do? They write a grant call in which they, out of all the possible things that an organization in Russia might do or in Georgia, they put 2-3 things that this organization might do. And then when they get 10 or 20 or 50 applications, they pick the 1 or 2 organizations that suit their interests best. So the matter of interest is real, and we see it in the process in which this is managed and enacted. And I do want to say it does go further. I mean, during last year's crisis around this law, around the same law last year, and this year's crisis, I heard again and again from Georgian activists that their Western donors, especially when they have offices in Georgia already, have not put pressure on them, not ordered them, but certainly pushed and prodded them into signing certain open letters, into saying certain things on like social media. So there is the relationship between donor and grantee is always one of power, and we mustn't forget that. And that power is used. Thank you.
Thank you, Almut. And this goes in some sense to my area of interest, which is soft power and public diplomacy. There's a very blurred line between soft power and what we call sharp power. And there's a question of what is benign influence and what is malign influence. And sometimes that's not very easy to separate. But Maxime, go ahead.
Yes, Eric, thank you so much. I just want to give a brief comment on what just had been said by Almut. So, well, okay, I mean, this position can be useful for such type of discussions like this one. But when we are talking about the legal mechanisms, when we are talking about the real law, when we are talking about the real implementation of the law in practice, we have to think first and foremost about the legal certainty principle, the core principle of the rule of law. And we cannot just assume that this organization is acting under control of the donor because we think about this connection between the interests of the donor and the activity of this NGO. It doesn't work like that. In the legal field, you must to prove that this position has clear evidence. The government must to prove that this organization works in the interests of this particular donor or in the interests of this particular foreign power or foreign source or foreign principle. And at least you have to formulate this in a very clear manner in the legal act. And this is the main problem, the main issue, and the main threat in the Russian law. And we all know very, very, very good the results and the consequences of this assumption approach towards the Russian NGOs. And unfortunately, the Georgian draft law also has already this issue and this threat inside the text of this law. I mean, you cannot reach democracy using non-democratic means, using non-democratic tools. And unfortunately, this kind of laws like Georgian law or Russian law or Hungarian law, and again, it's not my point of view only, it's also judicial practice and independent expert opinions. For example, I can give you a link to the ICNL last report about the comparative analysis of this legislation around the globe. And their approach, their position is that you have to create these laws in accordance with human-based approach, in accordance with the rule of law principles. And again, final point, I just again want to repeat this very, very clear. We cannot build legal practice and the implementation of legal tools, legislation. We can base it on our assumptions. We can have these thoughts in our minds. We can have this geopolitical structures and everything like that in our discussions. But again, when we're talking about the legal field, we must be very, very clear and very, very accurate and careful with these tools. Because on the other hand, we can have arbitrary decisions and the lack of the rule of law.
Thank you, Maxime. And finally, Anatol.
So, I mean, I'm sure there are others, but the only truly neutral and purely altruistic NGO I ever met in anywhere in the Caucasus was the Salvation Army. and their political interests are, of course, focused on the next world, not this one. As far as Georgia is concerned, I would simply repeat: let us wait for the next elections and monitor carefully how free and fair they are, and then let us see what comes out of that. That is the way to find out what a majority of Georgians want.
Excellent. Well, I do see a hand raised from Zurab Kanalidze, the rector of Sukhumi State University. We are unfortunately now way over time, but if you want to just make a very short comment, we'll be happy to hear your remarks. But I'd like to wrap up the conversation in a couple of minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to greet you, and I will continue speaking in my mother language, Georgian. Badallasha, ვიზიარებ თქვენს პოზიციას, მინდა უფრო ფრთხილები ვიყოთ შეფასებებში და ჩვენ საუბრობთ კანონზე საქართველოსთან მიმართებაში. ანუ საქართველოს ორიენტირთან კავშირში, საგარეო ორიენტირთან, საგარეო ვექტორთან კავშირში.
The rector is agreeing with the overall idea of being more pragmatic and cautious when it comes to regional politics and Georgia's role in the region. This law is basically within the context of Georgia's national security interests, and that's the position from which the rector is sort of basing it.
ჩვენი ფიქრის და ეჭვის საგანი არის შეიცვლის თუ არა საქართველოს საგარეო ორიენტირს. მე მინდა დაგარწმუნოთ გულწრფელად, რომ არა მხოლოდ არჩევანი საქართველოს, არამედ ჩვენი ბედისწერა, ჩვენი ევროპულობა და ჩვენი ევროპელობა.
Just to calm the waters, the rector is saying that he wants to make sure that everyone knows and wants to convey most sincerely that the geopolitical trajectory of Georgia will not change. It will remain to be a pro-Western, pro-European, pro-United States country.
ეს არის ქართული სახელმწიფოს, ქართველი ერის, ქართველი ხალხის გენეტიკური კოდია ჩადებული.
This basic right, this basic desire is within the collective memory and understanding of the Georgian people. There is no changing that.
მოგეხსენებათ, ევროპა ეყნობა ანტიკური სამყაროს გონიერებას და ქრისტიანული სამყაროს ზნეობრივ საფუძვლებს. ამ ჰარმონიამ განსაზღვრა ევროპული რენესანსი, რომლის ნაწილი, განუყოფელი ნაწილი არის ქართული სახელმწიფო, საქართველო.
So Georgia is part of the era of the European Renaissance through both religious and Christian perspective, as well as through international affairs and its socio-cultural aspects.
შორეულ წარსულში მე-12 საუკუნე გელათი.
All right.
ეს არის ახალი ათინა და მეორე იერუსალიმი.
And as a symbol of Georgia's sort of historic drive towards the West is the კიდე ერთხელ გაიმეორეთ ბოლო ნაწილი.
გელათი მე-12 საუკუნე. ეს არის ამ ორის სინთეზი, ახალი ათინა, მეორე იერუსალიმი.
So, from a historical perspective, Gelati, which is the historical church in Georgia, and Second Jerusalem is the sort of a symbolic philosophical proof of Georgia's pro-Western orientation that it has persisted throughout centuries, basically.
მაგრამ მე მინდა იცოდეთ სწორად, გავიგოთ სწორად, რომ საქართველოს მისი მდგომარეობიდან გამომდინარე არა აქვს შესაძლებლობა გამოკვეთოს და გადაიხაროს რომელიმე მიმართულებით.
And finally, and most importantly, perhaps, because of its geopolitical location and regional location, Georgia has simply no choice, doesn't have a luxury of either tilting either way, either to the east or the west or the north. So basically, it's a country that has to inadvertently play either basically a balancing role within the region and in global geopolitics.
ჩვენ აუცილებლად უნდა მოვახერხოთ სივრცის გაფართოება და სამოქმედო არეალის გაზრდა და ის, რასაც დღეს იწვევს გლობალიზაცია და რისკენაც გვიბიძგებს გლობალიზაცია, მოვახდინოთ სახელმწიფო პოლიტიკის, რეგიონული პოლიტიკის კონტექსტში გადატანა.
And because of that, this very narrow, tight, geopoliticized space has to be used as a common space, basically, for invitation of other powers, as well as for making sure that Georgia and the region does not tilt towards any other region in particular, but it sort of creates this sort of equilibrium where great powers and regional powers basically do business together without claiming particular or at least reducing the chances and risks of their respective claims for territorial expansionism.
პოლიტიკის მთავარი რეგულატორიდან გამომდინარე, დამატებითი ინტერესი და ბალანსი, მსგავსი მოდელი შექმნა საქართველოს შეუძლია მხოლოდ სამხრეთ კავკასიაში. გულისხმობ საქართველოს, აზერბაიჯანის, სომხეთი.
უკაცრავ, კიდევ ერთხელ რომ გაიმეოროთ უცებ.
პოლიტიკის მთავარი რეგულატორიდან გამომდინარე, დამატებითი ინტერესი და ბალანსი. ამ მოდელის შექმნა მხოლოდ სამხრეთ კავკასიაშია შესაძლებელი. იგივე იმ ინტერესებიდან გამომდინარე, დაპირისპირებული ძალების, კულტურების, ისტორიების, ცივილიზაციების, სისტემების, ტრანსნაციონალური კორპორაციების და ასე შემდეგ. თავსებადობის თვალსაზრისით, მათი.
So the region itself is made up in such a way that it is inherently a region where a balance of great powers can intersect, and the region can be made out to be a bridge rather than a corridor, for example. And so from the east to the west, the region should not be viewed as a field of regional conflicts or being used as a either Russia or the United States or European interest.
გავხადოთ, როგორც სამშვიდობო სივრცე ევროპული თოლგის ქვეშ.
And if we are truly trying to turn this region into a space of peace,
კარგად უნდა გავიგოთ, რომ საქართველოს არც აზერბაიჯანის, არც სომხეთის ამ შემთხვევაში არჩევანი საგარეო ვექტორის განსაზღვრის არ ნიშნავს, რომ მათ ეს არჩევანი ექნებათ. სურვილი არ განსაზღვრავს არჩევანს ცალ-ცალკე ქვეყნების. არჩევანს განსაზღვრავს ისტორიული კანონზომიერება და ამ კანონზომიერებას ქმნიან სწორედ ის ძალები, ვისი ინტერესებიც არის რეგიონში.
And more obviously, mere desires of nations, either of the three republics in the South Caucasus or Russia or the United States, mere desires and idealistic sort of wishful thinking does not determine the politics and sort of survival of the state, if you will, and the role of the region and those three republics in the South Caucasus. All right, Arik, thank you.
Thank you so much. We are delighted to have such a rich, enlightening, thought-provoking conversation with diverse perspectives. I would like to applaud each of our esteemed experts for taking the time to contribute to this conversation. And thank you for enlightening us and for sharing your perspectives with us. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you all very much. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.